Some moments in history seem almost impossible to understand. Moments when ordinary people become convinced that extraordinary things are happening, not because they're foolish and not because they're cruel, but because the world they live in teaches them to believe. Imagine you're 8 years old. You wake in the middle of the night. Your bedroom is almost completely dark. The fire in the hearth is burning low. Outside, the wind moves through the tall pine trees. Your parents are asleep. You pull the blanket a little tighter around your shoulders. Then you hear someone whisper your name. The next morning, you tell your parents something impossible. You say that during the night, the witches came for you. They carried you through the sky, over forests, over frozen lakes, to a place called Blåkulla, where the devil waits, a place where children are forced to dance, to feast, and to swear loyalty to evil itself. Today, most of us would assume a child had experienced a nightmare, or perhaps a vivid dream, but this isn't today. This is Sweden. The year is 1668. Almost no one doubts that the devil exists. Almost no one doubts that witches are real. So when a child says, "They took me," people don't ask, "Was it a dream?" They ask, "Who took you?" And when the child points to someone in the village, everything changes. A neighbor, a servant, a widow, a grandmother, one small finger, one accusation, one village. Before it's over, that single accusation will spread across Sweden. Hundreds of people will stand trial. More than 300 will lose their lives, not because anyone saw them cast a spell, not because anyone caught them worshiping the devil, but because enough people believed the children. This is the story of the Great Noise, the greatest witch panic in Swedish history. A story about fear, about faith, about the terrifying power of belief, and how quickly an ordinary community can convince itself that evil is living next door. Welcome back to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. Last episode, we stood on a frozen sea in the winter of 1658. We watched Karl X Gustav lead an army across the Great Belt, turning water itself into a weapon and reshaping the map of Scandinavia. It was one of the boldest military gambles in European history. A moment when Sweden stood at the height of its power, the Stormaktstid, the age of greatness, an empire stretching around much of the Baltic Sea, its armies feared across Europe, its borders larger than ever before. It's tempting to imagine that this was Sweden's golden age, an age of confidence, of certainty, of triumph. But history has a way of reminding us that nations, like people, can be strong in one moment and deeply afraid the next. Because empires aren't only built with soldiers, they're built with ordinary people. Farmers, priests, children, families trying to make sense of a world that often frightened them. And sometimes, the greatest danger facing society isn't an invading army, it's fear. The kind of fear that spreads from one neighbor to another, from one whispered story to another, until eventually an entire community becomes convinced that evil is living among them. Today, we are stepping away from the battlefields and into village churches, away from kings and toward ordinary people whose names would never appear in history books until they were accused of serving the devil. This is the story of the Great Noise, the greatest witch panic in Swedish history. A story about fear, about faith, about children whose words carried the weight of evidence, and about one question that still feels uncomfortable today. How do you prove someone is evil? Before we can understand what happened, we have to leave the 21st century behind. Because if we walk into a Swedish village in 1668 carrying our modern assumptions, nothing that follows will make sense. Imagine arriving just before Sunday morning. The church bell rings across the valley. Families leave their small wooden cottages. They walk the narrow paths through the forest toward the parish church. For many, this will be the only gathering they'll attend all week. This is where they pray, where they hear the news, where marriages are announced, where laws are proclaimed, where children are baptized, where the dead are remembered. The church isn't simply part of life, it is the center of life. And from the pulpit, week after week, they hear the same warning. The devil is real, he is patient, he is clever, and he is looking for souls. Today, many people think of the devil as symbolism, a metaphor for evil. But 17th century Sweden wasn't a metaphorical society. The devil wasn't an idea. He was a being. As real as wolves in the forest, as real as winter, as real as death. People believed he tempted their neighbors, ruined harvests, made children sick, killed livestock, turned ordinary people into servants of darkness. And there was scripture to support it. In the book of Exodus, one sentence carried enormous weight. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. That wasn't poetry. It wasn't symbolism. It was understood as God's command. Swedish law agreed. Witchcraft wasn't simply considered a sin. It was a capital crime, punishable by death. It's easy for us to dismiss these beliefs today, to wonder how anyone could have believed such things. But history asks something harder of us. It asks us not whether they were right, but whether their beliefs made sense inside the world they knew. Because if every sermon warned about the devil, if every illness had no scientific explanation, if crops failed without warning, if children died from diseases no one understood, where would you look for answers? The answer for many people was already waiting. The devil had done it. And if the devil was working, someone had to be helping him. While ordinary people were worried about salvation, Sweden itself stood at the height of its power. Just 10 years earlier, Karl X Gustav had crossed the frozen waters of the Great Belt and forced Denmark to surrender. The Swedish Empire now stretched farther than ever before. Its armies had conquered kingdoms, its diplomats negotiated with Europe's great powers. From the outside, it looked unstoppable, but appearances can be deceiving. Karl X Gustav was dead. His heir, Karl XI, was only 4 years old. The empire was governed by a regency. The treasury had been drained by decades of war. Taxes weighed heavily on the peasantry. Powerful nobles competed for influence. Beneath the confidence of a growing empire, there was uncertainty. And uncertainty has always had a habit of searching for explanations. Sometimes those explanations are found in facts. Sometimes they are found in fear. Every panic has a beginning. Sometimes it's a battle. Sometimes it's an assassination. Sometimes it's a child telling a story. The Great Noise began in 1668 in the parish of Älvdalen, deep in the forests of Dalarna. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, that place should sound familiar. This is the same region that sheltered Gustav Vasa during his fight from the Danes. The same forest where Engelbrecht's rebellion found its strength. A landscape of towering pines, small villages, long winters, and communities where everyone knew everyone else. It's the kind of place where stories travel quickly. Imagine hearing a knock at your door. Your neighbor has come to tell you something. Her daughter says she was taken during the night. Not kidnapped by soldiers, not by bandits, by witches. She says they carried her through the air, over forests, over frozen lakes to a place called Blåkulla. Now, Blåkulla wasn't a real place you could point to on a map. It belonged somewhere between folklore and religion. People imagined it as a distant island or an isolated meadow, a place where the devil gathered his followers, a place where everything sacred was turned upside down. According to the children, there was music, there was dancing, there were feasts, but nothing was quite right. The food tasted wrong. The laughter sounded wrong. Even joy itself had become twisted. Nothing felt human anymore. And sitting at the center of it all was the devil. The children described being forced to reject God, to swear loyalty to Satan, to receive his mark. Then they said they were sent home before dawn. If this had only been one child, perhaps the story would have ended there. Children dream, children imagine, children sometimes struggle to separate nightmares from reality. But then another child told the same story, and another, and then another, and the details were remarkably similar. And that made the stories even more believable. Night flights, Blåkulla, the devil, the witches. Soon, people began asking a different question. Not, did this happen? But who is taking the children? And that's when everything changed. Because the children didn't simply describe what happened. They named the people responsible. Neighbors, servants, midwives, widows, the elderly woman who lived alone at the edge of a village. People everyone knew. Can you imagine standing in church, surrounded by people you've known your entire life, when a child points at you and calmly says, "She took me to the devil"? No physical evidence, no witnesses, just a child's certainty. And in a world where the devil was considered real, sometimes that was enough. Why did the children tell these stories? The honest answer is we don't know. History rarely gives us access to what people were thinking, especially children. Some historians believe they truly believed what they were saying. The world around them was filled with sermons about Satan, stories of witches, warnings about temptation. Nightmares may have felt as real as waking life. Others believe something more complicated was happening. For perhaps the first time in their lives, adults listened to every word they said. Priests listened, magistrates listened, parents listened. In a society where children had very little power, their voices suddenly carried extraordinary weight. Whatever the reason, the story spread. One child influenced another, details became more shared, memories became collective, and before long, the fear itself became contagious. At first, the adults weren't convinced. Local priests had heard strange stories before. Children exaggerated. Children dreamed. Children sometimes lied. Magistrates knew that memories could be unreliable. One child's accusation wasn't enough to condemn a neighbor. At least it wasn't supposed to be. But then something happened that changed the entire investigation. The children began saying that if anyone doubted them, they were helping the devil. Think about the position that placed people in. Imagine you're the village priest. Every Sunday, you've stood before your congregation preaching that Satan is real, that he tempts, that he deceives, that witches exist. Now a frightened child stands before you and says, "The witches took me." If you dismiss the child, are you ignoring a victim? Or worse, are you ignoring the work of the devil himself? Suddenly, skepticism doesn't feel courageous, it feels dangerous. No priest wanted to be remembered as the man who ignored Satan. No magistrate wanted to explain to Stockholm why he failed to stop witchcraft. Fear had become evidence, and once it entered, it changed the rules. The Crown established a special commission, not because anyone had found physical evidence, not because anyone had caught witches in the act, but because the accusations had become too numerous and too frightening to ignore. Lawyers, clergy, royal officials, they traveled from parish to parish, setting up temporary courts, listening to testimony, questioning the children, arresting the accused. For many villagers, this was probably the first time representatives of the Crown had come to investigate something happening inside their own community. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't just gossip anymore. It was now an affair of the state. Now comes the hardest part to listen to. Imagine hearing a knock at your door. You open it, and several men are standing outside. You've lived in this village your entire life. You've raised your children, worked on your farm, attended church every Sunday. You know every face standing in front of you, and they tell you you are under arrest. Not for stealing, not for murder, for serving the devil. How do you defend yourself against that? You can't prove you didn't fly during the night. You can't prove you never attended Blåkulla. How do you prove something that never happened? The accused were taken away, questioned for hours, sometimes days, often isolated from their families, shown the instruments of torture, told that confession might save their soul, even if it couldn't save their life. Some refused until the end, others eventually broke, not necessarily because they were guilty, but because human beings have limits. History has shown us this again and again and again. People under unbearable pressure will sometimes confess to things they never did. And once a confession existed, even one extracted under enormous pressure, it became evidence. Not only against the person who confessed, against everyone they named. Because according to the logic of the trials, a witch never acted alone. One confession became 2 arrests, 2 arrests became 5, 5 became 20. The panic was no longer growing because of rumors. Now the courts themselves were feeding it. One place would become the center of the panic, a small town in Dalarna called Mora. Its churches, its courtrooms, its ordinary families. Within a few months, it would become the epicenter of the greatest witch panic in Swedish history. Imagine you have now been tried and accused of witchcraft. You wake up knowing that it's your last morning on earth. You haven't slept much. The church bells ring, just as they always have. The same bells you've heard your entire life. The bells that marked baptisms, weddings, funerals. Now they are ringing for you. Outside, your neighbors are already gathering. Some came because they believe justice is about to be done. Others came because everyone is expected to be there. No one wants to stay home on a day like this. You look around, you recognize almost every face. People you've worshipped beside. People you've borrowed tools from. People who once shared meals at your table. Some won't meet your eyes, others stare. A few are crying. Somewhere in the crowd, a child who accused you is standing with their family. Does she still believe what she said? We'll never know. You are led to the place of execution. The sentence is read aloud. Now we need to pause, because it's easy to imagine these executions as scenes from a Hollywood film. But they weren't. They were public events. The entire community was expected to witness them. These weren't strangers dying. They were neighbors. They were the midwives, servants, widows, and grandmothers, the people who had helped bring children into the world, who had baked bread, worked fields, cared for the sick. And now the same community stood together, watching them die. Over the course of the panic between 1668 and 1676, more than 300 people were executed for witchcraft in Sweden. The exact number is difficult to determine because some records have been lost. Most of those executed were women. Many were older. Many were poor. Many already lived on the margins of society. That wasn't a coincidence. When fear searches for an enemy, it often begins with people least able to defend themselves. Execution itself wasn't intended to send a message. In many cases, those condemned were first beheaded before their bodies were burned at the stake. This was considered an act of mercy because death came before the flames. Others were burned alive. Fire wasn't chosen at random. People believed it purified evil, that it destroyed the devil's work completely. But here's the part that stays with me. Eventually, the fire burned out. The crowd drifted home. Someone still had to milk the cows. Someone still had to chop firewood. Children still needed supper. Life continued, except one chair at the table would always remain empty. One voice would never again be heard in church. One path through the village would never again be walked. Fear had consumed one of its own, and then it looked for another. Panic has a strange quality. It grows slowly. Then suddenly it seems unstoppable. Until one day, it isn't. The witch panic didn't end because Sweden stopped believing in witches. Far from it. Most people still believed the devil was real. Most still believed witchcraft existed. What changed was something much more fragile: confidence. At first, the accusations had been directed toward people on the margins: widows, servants, older women, people with little power to defend themselves. Few dared to question their guilt, but panic has a way of refusing to stay where it's comfortable. Eventually, the children began naming different people, respectable people, the wives of prominent citizens, members of influential families, people whose friends sat in positions of authority. Suddenly, the question wasn't, could this woman be a witch? It became, could the children be wrong? For years, almost no one dared to ask that question. Now they had no choice. Some of the stories no longer made sense. Different children described the same events in different ways. Details changed, contradictions appeared. Some children quietly admitted they hadn't told the truth. Others said they had been influenced by stories they'd already heard. The certainty that had driven the panic began to crack. The Swedish authorities started looking more carefully at the evidence, not because belief in witchcraft had disappeared, but because the testimony no longer seemed reliable. The special commissions were dissolved, the trials slowed, then they stopped. The fires that had burned for years went cold. But endings like this are never clean. More than 300 people were already dead. Families had been destroyed. Children had grown up carrying memories they could never erase. Villages had learned to fear their own neighbors. How do you ask forgiveness from someone whose mother you helped condemn? How do you rebuild trust when your own child testified against the woman next door? History doesn't tell us those conversations. It rarely records the silence that comes afterward. But perhaps the silence tells us everything, because once the execution stopped, the survivors still had to live together. Every Sunday, they met again at the same church, walked the same roads, worked in the same fields. Only now, everyone knew what fear had made them capable of. The panic was over, the executions had ended, but the questions they left behind have never really gone away. So, what do we do with a story like this? It's easy to place it safely in the past, to tell ourselves that these were people from another age, less educated, more superstitious, living in a world that we can barely recognize. That explanation is comforting. It also lets us off the hook. Because if that's true, then this story has nothing to teach us. But history is rarely that simple. The people we've been talking about weren't monsters. They weren't unusually cruel. Most were ordinary people. Parents, farmers, priests, neighbors, people who believed they were protecting their community. That's what makes this story so unsettling. The tragedy wasn't caused by evil people. It was caused by ordinary people becoming convinced that they were fighting evil. History likes to whisper a comforting lie. It tells us if we had been there, we would have been the skeptical one, the person asking difficult questions, the neighbor defending the accused. Maybe. I'd like to think that about myself too. But history is rarely that generous. Most people don't realize they're living through a moral panic until years later, when the evidence looks obvious, when the fear has faded, when it's safe to ask the questions no one wanted to ask before. That's one reason historians continue to study the Great Noise. Not because they believe witches were real, but because the fear was. Fear changed the way people listened, the way they judged evidence, the way they saw their neighbors. It convinced ordinary communities to do extraordinary things. Every generation is certain about something. Every generation believes it sees the world clearly. History has a habit of humbling that certainty. Today, the forests of Dalarna are peaceful. The villages are quiet. Children still laugh in courtyards. Church bells still echo across the valleys. It's difficult to imagine that these same places once lived in constant fear. But the landscape remembers. History always leaves traces. Sometimes they're castles, sometimes they're battlefields, and sometimes they are stories just like this. Stories that remind us how precious justice really is, how fragile trust can be, and how dangerous certainty becomes when it no longer asks for evidence. We tell these stories not to judge the people who came before us, but to better understand ourselves. Because perhaps the most important question history can ask isn't, how could they have believed that? Perhaps it's, what are we absolutely certain about today that future generations may one day struggle to understand? What witch hunt are we facing today? Until next time, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard. Tack så mycket för att ni lyssnat. Vi hörs nästa gång.